Welcome to Major Intonio's presentation of 13 Days, The Chronicle of an Escape from a German Prison, by Captain John Caunter, Gloucestershire Regiment, published in 1918. Introduction.
On placing before the public this account of my escape from Germany and some episodes from my life in 2 prison camps, I feel that I must make clear that it was only due to the fact that I had 2 definite supplementary objects to attain that I succeeded in making myself launch out in the following pages. The first of these objects is to add my quota to the information before the public relating to the treatment and existence of those who, in prisons in Germany, have suffered and are suffering for their country. My second object is to try to throw a little light on the marvelous spirit of the prisoners as a whole. Think what it means to be shut up for years under such conditions. Let me quote the prisoner poet Lieutenant Harvey, who in Gloucestershire Friends vividly describes what prison means in the following lines. Laugh, oh laugh loud, all ye who long ago adventure found in gallant company, safe in stagnation. Laugh, laugh bitterly, while on this filthiest backwater of time's flow, drift we and rot till something set us free. It is always a fight against this sort of thing that the prisoner of war is waging. Some apparently find such a fight difficult, but the majority do somehow keep a hold on themselves and retain their energy and hopefulness. Barbed wire disease is now officially recognized. An internment in neutral countries of those who have done the longest spells in prison is the outcome of this. It will readily be conceded that those who keep cheerful throughout their cruel trials display wonderful moral courage. But what about another class of prisoner? The prisoner who tries to escape, is caught, does 3-month cells, is released, tries to escape again, meets the same fate, and does another stretch of perhaps 6 months this time, but only goes on trying. There are some who have spent 2.5 years out of 3 in Germany in cells for attempts to escape. There are many who have made 6 or 7 attempts. I, who only had 1 determined attempt and succeeded, am able to say it. These men are of the salt of the earth. I have heard some chicken-hearted persons who say that nobody ought to try to escape because it might make it worse for those left behind. There is only one answer to that sort of person. However, it is not a fact that others get punished for the escape of individuals, although it was true on 2 occasions in 1914, so the question hardly arises. Very few people in this country seem to realize that the German, being a bully, has the characteristics of a bully. If a strong attitude is taken with him, he immediately gives way. Collectively and individually, they cannot understand any argument but force, whether it takes the form of a reprisal or a great attack at the front. Since my return to England, I have often been asked, what do the Germans think of the war now, and are they hard up for food, etc.? The Germans I talked to were thoroughly fed up with the war and only wanted peace. This does not mean that they will break out into revolution. That, to my mind, cannot come about until the military defeat of Germany is a fact. The Kaiser, not too popular nowadays, would immediately regain his former position in the minds of his subjects, could he but secure a peace even partially favorable to the German people. The rulers of Germany know that defeat, or anything like it, would be fatal for them. That is why they will stick at nothing and spare no spilling of blood until they have either won or lost irretrievably. What would a patched-up peace mean? It would mean that Germany would begin building submarines by the 100 for use against us within 10 years' time. It would mean just an armistice for a few years, and then a renewal of the conflict without Russia and probably many of our other exhausted allies. The Germans with whom I spoke knew this and looked at the future with open eyes. I wonder if it is realized how much the British are hated by the Germans. Their hate of us is colossal, to use their own expressive word. Somebody in Germany said that should the Germans ever get into England, they would make Belgium appear like a Garden of Eden in comparison with what England would look like after they had done with her. It is a German boast that the war has never touched the sacred soil of the fatherland. The few occasions on which our aeroplanes bombed German towns during my stay there gave me an excellent opportunity of judging how sensitive they are to this particular form of punishment. The bombing of Karlsruhe and Freiburg caused a scream throughout the west of Germany. I heard the echo of it in the canteen at Krefeld. When I suggested that London had also been bombed and innocent lives lost, they simply said that that was different. Thus, in their minds, there are two kinds of law, one for England, the other for Germany. I was very pleased to notice how much less was the effect of air raids on our civilian population than on the Germans. There is no doubt whatever that the fear of air bombardments is much stronger in Germany than over here. There is only one way of touching the German mind, and that is by the employment of force, brute force. It is what he believes in as the medicine for his enemies, simply because he judges others by himself, and knows that he respects that, and that only, and therefore applies it whenever possible to others. It is a pity that our public does not know more of the German mentality. It is a knowledge of this factor that should assist one in having a correct view of things and in understanding German aspirations and methods. A word about food and supplies generally. The Germans are extremely hard up for food. In the spring of 1917, meat was practically unobtainable. The bread was disgusting and scarce. Potatoes had to be procured by standing in queues for hours. This, as a matter of fact, has been the rule for the last year and a half. Mangelwurzels, Swedes, black peas, and turnips form the greater part of the food. The town of Krefeld in February 1917 was like a place of the dead, absolutely deserted, except at the hour when the workers went home. The shops have practically nothing to sell in their windows. To get a shirt or a towel or any such article, a permit had to be got from the town authorities. Boots were a difficult problem. All the children wore wooden shoes. Leather could not be got for love or money nearly 2 years ago. It is extraordinary how the German people put up with their hardships. People ignorant of the true state of affairs in Germany have sometimes asked me if the Germans are shorter of food and other things than we are. I always have to laugh as the question is so ridiculous to me. There is absolutely no comparison between the two countries. I often see articles in the papers on the conditions that obtain in Germany written by persons who know, and I hear people doubt the veracity of them. I can truthfully say that I have not yet seen the article or item of news from Germany which I, from my point of vantage, did not absolutely believe. It is a pity that people will not believe what men who have been in Germany have to say on the subject.
Part 1, Chapter 1, Krefeld.
I was taken prisoner at Galluveld, 31st October 1914, and arrived at Krefeld prison camp on the evening of the 2nd November with 10 other officers brought in from various parts of the Ypres front. It was the same old story every time that one heard, on asking what had happened in any particular sector of the battlefield. The impression we got from the sum total of these descriptions led us to think that a German breakthrough to Ypres and beyond was a certainty during the evening of the 31st. We had been taken through the German reserves while being transported to the rear, and had seen the thousands of fresh men they had got massed behind their fighting armies. Menin, Wervik, and other places were packed with troops. Every farm and cottage held its full complement of armed boats. On the railway, trains passed westwards every few minutes, crammed with troops, destined for the Ypres battle. It was not surprising that we prisoners, who knew the exact strength of the British Army, and also the fact that all units were having hard fighting and that nothing was left in reserve, should feel depressed and wonder if it was possible that the Germans would fail to use their great opportunity. I have often been asked how our prisoners are treated in Germany. The only correct answer to this is that the treatment varies according to the time and place and the type of German who comes into contact with them. In 1914, it was generally the same throughout Germany. In those days, the treatment was exceedingly bad. Every prisoner taken then has seen or experienced some brutality or insulting behavior on the part of Germans. For my part, I, on first becoming a prisoner, was spat at and called all the choice names their musical language can provide. I saw a British soldier with a shrapnel wound in the back, made to carry a heavy German pack which bumped up and down on the open wound. This fact was remarked upon by a German private soldier who, more humane than the rest, protested against this treatment. But the Unteroffizier would not alter his order, and the wounded man had to carry his burden for 7 miles or more. When asked for water at Aix-la-Chapelle railway station by prisoners who had hardly had a drop to drink for 2 days and scarcely a scrap of food to eat, I heard the Red Cross ladies reply, "For an Engder, 9." At Cologne station, I saw the brute beasts of German officials haul 3 or 4 of the most miserable British private soldiers they could find out of the cattle trucks and place them on the platform to be baited by the populace, comprised largely of women. There were German officers on the platform, so there was no excuse. It could have been stopped instantly by them. There were many other incidents, too numerous to mention, but similar and worse stories will be told by the thousand after the war. The treatment of prisoners has steadily improved since those days. No longer do the Germans openly insult and knock prisoners about to the same extent, except in out-of-the-way places and when they have a particularly cowed and defenseless lot to deal with. I have heard from officers taken prisoners in 1916 that they were reasonably treated when captured. It is much changed now, according to general report. While waiting at Cologne station for our train for Krefeld, we were locked in a cell under the stairs of the station. Although expecting to receive food here and being told that it was with that object that we had been put in this place, nothing of this kind materialized. However, we had the great honor of being visited by a German general and a young female of high rank who could speak a little English. This she aired and asked us several silly questions. She was much taken with S.'s height, comparing him to some Carl or other. It was a kind of private show of the wild beasts at the zoo, in which we acted the parts of the animals. On arrival at Krefeld station, a hostile crowd was ready to receive us, and we were hurried as quickly as possible into the trains waiting there in order to get us away from the attentions of the populace. As it was, 2 of the 11 officers in my party were hit with sticks, the wielders of which had pushed their way through the escort of German soldiers accompanying us. We were not sorry to reach the barracks and get away from these demonstrations of the unpopularity of England in this town. Krefeld, a great center of the silk industry, had suffered heavily by the entry of England into the war. Once inside the camp, we had time to spare for anything we wished to do, which naturally meant food first, sleep next, and after some time a wash and shave. The barracks of the Krefeld Hussars, now wired in and used as a prison camp, are large and strongly built. The prisoners occupied 3 large buildings, and a 4th smaller one provided mess rooms and canteen, etc. There was a gravel parade square in the middle of the ground between the buildings. This we used as a place for exercise. This square was 140 yards long by about 80 yards wide. It made an excellent association football ground when cleared of big stones, and in the summer, by dint of hard labor, we turned it into a number of tennis courts. Until he got command of Belgium, von Bissing, the brute responsible for the death of Nurse Cavell, was the general in charge of the particular army command which included Krefeld in its jurisdiction. On the walls of the prison camp, an order signed by Bissing was posted, which informed all the prisoners that they were the inferiors of all Germans, whatever rank they might hold. The order also warned us against trying to evade our fate by escaping. It continued, "The guards are earnest men, knowing their duty." This caused the nickname "earnest men" to be given to them. I wish Bissing could have known how we laughed at his special order. The Boche has no sense of humor, or he could never have put a thing like that on the walls for Englishmen to laugh at and ridicule generally. For the first year or so, only 7 officers were allotted to the smaller rooms and 14 to the larger ones. But these numbers were eventually increased, first to 8 and 16 respectively, and then to 9 and 18. At first, we had a cupboard each, but later, 4 had to do duty for 7 officers. The beds were iron, with wooden planks supporting a hard mattress, sometimes filled with straw or wood shavings, which was changed on 1 or 2 occasions. During the first few months, we had only small oil lamps for lighting purposes, at a scale of 1 per 7 officers. It was impossible for everyone to read at the same time. We used to sit over the fire for warmth, and the 3 nearest to the lamp could manage to see sufficiently in the evenings to read the few Tauchnitz editions we had been able to purchase through a tradesman, who was allowed into the barracks twice a week. As nearly all greatcoats and waterproofs had been taken away from prisoners at the time of their capture, we felt the effects of the cold pretty considerably. Roll calls took place at 8 a.m. and 9:30 p.m., generally out of doors. We often went on these roll calls in the early days with our blankets over our shoulders. A welcome supply of soldiers' greatcoats was sent through the American embassy about Christmas time. During the first winter, there were about 250 Russians, 200 French, 120 English, and a few Belgian officers in the camp. That first winter was by far the worst of the 3 I spent there. We had not got to understand the true nature of the German official reports, and for some time they depressed us. Parcels began coming in December, but the Germans made us pay duty on them for a time, and as we had very little money in those days, they were not so welcome as they became at a later date when the duty was removed. As time went by, conditions in the camp improved, but until the summer of 1915, we had great difficulty in getting permission to do anything to make ourselves more comfortable. In the early summer of 1915, 35 British officers were sent to Cologne to be imprisoned in cells as a reprisal against the alleged maltreatment of German submarine crews. The majority of this number went from Krefeld. After 2 months or more, the reprisal having ended, they came back, looking very white and ill. Sometime in the month of June of this year, a successful escape was made by 3 Russians, and 3 others who got out of the camp the following night were recaught. Apparently, they crossed the Dutch frontier but got tied up in swampy ground and had to return across the frontier into German territory again, in search of a way out of this bad stretch of country. It was while attempting this that they were seen by a German patrol and recaptured. The whole affair was badly managed. The theory which many prisoners held and worked upon consisted of allowing each small party 24 hours start so that they might have a good chance of getting across the frontier, some 18 miles away, before the next lot tried, who if caught at once would cause the Germans to discover the departure of others at the nominal roll call always held after an attempt to escape. If anyone is missed at these roll calls, the frontier guards are warned by wire. The frontier is guarded just the same, whether an escaped prisoner is reported out or not, so getting away unknown is not a necessity. Of this I am absolutely certain from after knowledge of the conditions, but of course nobody knew definitely what was the best course of action at that time. The mentality of the Boer on the subject of escape is curious. In the early days, anyone who tried to escape and was caught was the subject of particular dislike among the Germans, besides suffering his usual term of punishment in cells. I suppose becoming accustomed to these attempts altered their point of view, as latterly indifference towards evildoers of this nature was displayed by them, and the punishment term of cells was administered and given with the same lack of interest or emotion as the matron of a boys' preparatory school displays on dosing her charges all round with medicine. During the first winter in prison, we built up a library, which eventually became a large affair with a librarian and a room to itself. Some prisoners managed to continue playing cards from their first days in prison until I left, and I suppose will continue to do so without ceasing until the day of their release. Personally, after the first year I spent in captivity, I hated the sight of a card and played very seldom. The orchestra, from modest beginnings, grew into a really excellent institution. Most of the instruments were hired from the town of Krefeld. By dint of asking repeatedly, we persuaded the Germans to allow us to run a theater, which also developed from an extremely crude state into what was really quite a respectable affair. The main difficulty with which our theatrical manager had to contend was the lack of material for girls in the cast. However, practice and hard training turned out some passable ones in time. The French were more fortunate in this respect than the English. They are all born actors, it seems, and they found 2 or 3 really excellent male actresses. The Russians also produced theatrical displays, but were not so persevering in that respect as the French and British. Periodically, the camp used to be visited by German officers on leave from the front, We used to stare at them, and they at us, and beyond the necessary salute, took no particular notice of each other. One thing about the uniform of German officers drew our attention. Although the top half of them appeared smart enough, they always looked sloppy about the legs. Often one would see a German officer with a reasonably well-cut coat, but his breeches would be perfectly impossible. His leggings were worse than his breeches, and looked as if they must have been picked up at a second-hand clothes dealer's. They never fitted, and besides giving their wearers' legs the same shape all the way down, generally ended off with their edges half an inch clear of the boots all the way round. The leather of these leggings looked as if it was made of papier-mâché. Being generally of a light yellowish-brown color, they at any rate matched the boots, for the latter were nearly always of that particularly aggressive tone of yellow often seen in the shop windows in England. The German officer seems to like this color, and has it preserved by his servant, whereas we get rid of it at once. I suppose these officers in their new uniforms criticize the generally unkempt appearance of the English officers in prison extremely unfavorably, not realizing that anything is good enough for a prison, and the less new stuff we got from home, the less unimportant work we gave to the hard-worked tailors endeavoring to cope with the millions of uniforms required by our growing armies. In the spring of 1916, we were allowed by the British government to give our paroles for purposes of walks and other recreation. This enabled us to go to the dentist in the town. This dentist, although extremely short-sighted, did not do such bad work, provided you found the hole for him. He did his best for us, and his charges were extraordinarily reasonable. These visits to the dentist were naturally very popular, as they enabled us to see new sights and get away from the horrible prison for a few hours. The dentist scored heavily, as he always had a waiting list and continuous work to do for the prisoners. As a man, he was about as unfit for war as anyone could imagine, and yet they called him up eventually. Being a weedy specimen, small and pasty-faced, with such short sight that he had the greatest difficulty in seeing anything, he had been returned as totally exempt time after time by the army doctors. But during the winter of 1916 to 1917, the weeding out committee of Germans arrived at Krefeld, and once more he was examined. To everyone's surprise, and to his most of all, they passed him fit, and off he had to go. It cheered one up to see them need such a man in their armies. The commandant, who, together with the vast majority of Germans, believed in a great German victory over the whole world in 1914, began his career as our chief gaoler as an autocrat of the Prussian type. Various objectionable things were done by his orders. Not the least objectionable of these was the stopping of smoking, when Major Vandeleur escaped in December 1914. After a fortnight, we regained our tobacco and were allowed to smoke until a similar episode occurred when the same penalty was imposed. Sometime in the spring of 1915, 3 French officers attempted to escape, but at the last minute, having already gained the outside of the camp, came back into the prison, and in so doing were fired upon by a German sentry who saw them. As the names of these officers were not known to the German authorities, they ordered a roll call and demanded their names from the senior French officer. Naturally, the request was not granted, so the commandant said that all smoking would be stopped for all officers of the camp, unless the names were forthcoming at once. Again, he was disappointed, and the tobacco was once more collected. This time, most of the parcels of tobacco were filled with lumps of coal and other unimportant trifles, while we smoked like schoolboys on the sly. Up the chimney was the favorite place for this. During the summer of 1915, the commandant changed his tone a bit, and steadily improved from that time forward. Eventually, there arrived a time when we could consider him a fair and just commandant, and although no friend of England or the English, he managed to get on very well with his English prisoners. The French, however, were never able to satisfy their consciences on the subject sufficiently to look upon him as anything but one of the worst. This was too severe. The commandant complained that when he passed them, they would turn their backs on him in order to avoid having to salute him. Relations between the English and the Allies were always of the best. About half the English preferred the Russians, while the other half preferred the French. There were many amusing incidents constantly occurring if one could raise sufficient sense of humor to enjoy them. One typical example of the way in which we got some amusement out of our guards happened one morning when a German fatigue party was in the barracks loading up a wagon. One of the men had taken off his uniform cap and hung it up by the entrance to one of the buildings. Along came a certain English officer, interested in anything which might assist him to escape, saw the cap, snatched it up, and hid it inside his coat while passing into the building. 10 minutes or so later, the work being finished, the German soldier looked round for his cap. Meanwhile, the story of the annexation of the cap had gone the round of the prison. So, when the wretched Boer passed along the front of the building with his bald pate shining in the sunlight, he had to run the gauntlet of a crowd of heads peering from all the windows and roaring with laughter at him. For a long time, I, like the majority of Englishmen, was in a room half English, half French. We really got on very well together, but the usual rock upon which French and English split cropped up in our case. We English wanted a fair proportion of the windows open. The French, on the other hand, wanted them shut, complaining of les courants d'air mortels, droughts. A compromise was the only possible solution of this universal trouble. On one occasion, our Allied friends received a consignment of live snails from France, which they proceeded to cook with garlic on a small spirit stove in our room. The smell was appalling. I had to bolt from the room, although I am not over particular. The odor of snails hung about for days afterwards. These same friends of ours took up fret sawing as a hobby. Have you ever tried to live in a room in which 5 or 6 fret saws are working for hours at a time? They used to commence work before breakfast sometimes. However, we stuck it without complaining for months. We had a most extraordinary prison companion in the person of a Russian who received the nickname of Cuckoo. This Russian was not really an officer at all, but during the Great Russian retreat from Poland was a transport driver. Finding, or otherwise coming by, an officer's great coat, he was dressed in it when taken prisoner with many thousands of others. The Germans, who were not able to prove whether all officers were genuine, naturally concluded that he was one and took him to an officers' internment camp in Germany. During his wanderings from camp to camp, he one day came to Krefeld. The Cuckoo grew his hair long, abnormally long, so that it fell in a matted mass, reaching to his shoulders. It was said that he had vowed never to cut his hair until the Germans had been kicked out of his village. He was called the Cuckoo because, when one day he had climbed a tree, he was asked what he was doing by some officer, and replied that he was a cuckoo. This extraordinary person was not allowed to feed with the Russian officers, as they objected to having him with them. So he had to have his meals between the two services, which were normally within an hour of each other. The English officers belonging to the first service were always late in leaving the table, and so were frequently in the large dining room when the Cuckoo was fed. It was a sight never to be forgotten. His manner of eating was truly marvelous. On some occasions, dried smoked fish were part of the meals, and the Cuckoo would pounce on these like a vulture and gnaw one, holding it by the head and tail with both hands. This was not his only stunt. Another good one was the way in which he shoveled food down. His hands worked absolutely feverishly to supply his insatiable appetite. Great gulps of tea were rapidly interspersed, for lubricating purposes, I suppose. For all that, I can say that I saw him at the bath, which is more than can be said for all the prisoners in the camp. A really plucky, but at the same time comic attempt to escape was made one spring by a certain officer who went by the sobriquet of Peeping Tom. The refuse heaps and dustbins were cleared out daily by an old German man and a boy, who removed the rubbish in a heavy 2-wheeled cart drawn by an old ox. This rubbish cart in these days used to leave the camp without being carefully searched and was emptied some distance from it. This fact was naturally well known to the prisoners, but the question, which most people took to be unanswerable, was how to remain hidden in the rubbish and yet be alive at the end of the unpleasant journey. It remained for Peeping Tom to think of a gas mask in connection with this scheme. borrowing one from an officer who had been lately brought in from the front and had retained possession of this article of equipment, he dressed himself in it, and choosing a moment when the German boy was looking the other way and the old man had departed on some other business, he rushed to the cart and got inside. A well-trained batch of English soldier servants then arrived, each armed with a bucketful of rubbish, which they threw over the top of him, successfully hiding him from view. All would now have been well, had not fate cruelly intervened, in the shape of an old German who worked the bathhouse furnace, and who occasionally came out for a breath of fresh air. Seeing this extraordinary-looking object disappear into the cart, the old Boer fetched his cap and went off to the commandant's office to report the strange event. Remarking this, another officer who had been assisting the attempt walked past the cart and warned Peeping Tom that he had been seen and must get out. Suddenly, a horrible-looking object rose from the middle of the cart, sending a shower of empty tins and other rubbish in all directions. For a moment, his peaky, masked face peered round, and then leaping from the cart, he went like the wind for the room of a friend in the nearest building. The German boy nearly fell flat on his back from fright when he saw this apparition, and could do nothing to hinder its escape from the cart. The Germans arrived in force shortly afterwards, but their bird had flown. From that day onwards, the rubbish was pierced with spikes every time it passed through the main gate, so that this scheme never had another chance. During the earlier days of our captivity, impromptu sing-songs sometimes used to take place. On one particular occasion, this led to trouble with our prison authorities. Empire Day was a day which could be made something of by the English, as a set-off to the numerous saints' days and fetes of the French and Russians. This particular Empire Day, which we had decided to celebrate as a jour de fête, happened to be the day of the declaration of war between Italy and Austria. The noise made by the Empire Day celebrators was quite appreciable and sufficiently loud to reach the ears of the many town people promenading up and down outside the camp. As these Germans had just heard that their so-called ally and friend, Italy, had declared war on Austria, thus upsetting German calculations, they were very angry and depressed. On hearing these sounds of cheerful voices and other manifestations of joy, they naturally concluded that our Empire Day celebrations had been especially arranged in order to celebrate the entry of Italy into the war, which fact, combined with their feeling of depression and indignation at what they termed Italian treachery, made them wild with rage, and complaints were sent in to the commandant, who believed also that the noise had been due to a celebration in honor of Italy. It was only after most persistent declarations on the part of the British senior officers that it was at last satisfactorily explained to the commandant. On the whole, we were exceedingly fortunate in our German officers at Krefeld. One of them, however, was a most ludicrous person. He was nicknamed the Crab on account of his gait. He wore cuffs, which always asserted their independence from his shirt when he raised his hand to the salute. This Crab was a fool in his dealings with the prisoners, and various little incidents occurred between him and his charges. On one occasion, the order against smoking on parade was re-read to the prisoners, and then the German officers kept their eyes open for smoke for a time after this. The Crab one day saw an English officer smoking and took his name, with the result that the victim got 3 days' cells. In the course of his campaign against smoking, he next came up against the French. One of these was observed to be smoking and accused of it. However, he declared his absolute innocence, and the Crab was nonplussed. On looking round, he found that the whole crowd of Frenchmen were smoking and roaring with laughter at him. This was too much for him to tackle, and he gave it up. Occasionally, our allies received him with a chorus of coughs or suppressed cheers if he came on parade late. A very fine attempt to escape was made by a naval officer who used the Crab as his model. One evening, knowing that the Crab was busy in the camp and would not be passing out of the commandanter gate for a few minutes, the naval officer, dressed a la Crab to the last button, presented himself at the first barrier and got easily through without causing any suspicion. At the next gate, however, the sentry, as a matter of form, asked him for his pass, but unfortunately, not being conversant with the language, he was unable to understand what was required of him. Otherwise, a word in answer, and the production of anything at all resembling the pass might easily have sufficed to allay the man's suspicions. Instead of which, the sentry had to repeat his question several times, each time becoming more suspicious of this strangely silent German officer. It wasn't very long before they discovered the trick which was being played on them, and arrest quickly followed. The commandant, it was said, was extremely amused over the whole affair, and made the naval officer show him how he had copied the crab walk. He then sent for the crab, who came to his office to find his double staring at him. The commandant roared with laughter, but the crab only vouchsafed "very clever" in English as his remarks on the subject, looking very fed up the while. All the German employees in the prison used to laugh at the crab, so this little masquerade caused a good deal of amusement among them. We were always hearing rumors from someone who claimed to be in the know about the mobilization of the Dutch army and a rapid attack on Germany. This interested us very much, of course, as we had visions of being released by Dutch cavalry. However, cheering as these rumors were at first, they became decidedly unpopular when nothing ever happened according to the program of the rumor. Sometimes we heard of misgivings in the town when our offensives were stretching the German armies to cracking point. The people didn't believe their official reports without applying a grain of salt to them first, on many occasions. The Times was largely read in the town, and I have heard it actually said by a German that he read it so as to get news of the war, the German papers containing nothing but stuff entirely favorable to the fatherland. There was an official report issued by the great headquarters every afternoon, and this appeared in the Extra Blatt, a yellow sheet of paper specially printed. This Extra Blatt used to be carried past the prison by an old Boer who always shouted the same thing: heavy losses of the English, French, and Russians. At last, after hearing him daily for 2 years or more, the prisoners began to assert themselves, and he was received with cheers, which daily grew louder, until the commandant ordered that the old man should not come past any more, and give opportunities for the prisoners to practice their sarcasm at the expense of the communiques of the great headquarters. The reports about the Jutland battle sent the Germans into a great state of excitement. At first, they were very happy, while we said very little to those Boches we met about the camp. A day or two later, their joy was rather more assumed than real, until nearly a week afterwards, the sudden marvelous discovery by the German authorities that they had lost some more ships, and the consequent admission of this unfortunate little fact, finally wiped out altogether the dreams of a German domination of the seas, which many deluded people seemed to consider a fait accompli after that battle. It was then our turn to smile and drop insinuations and hints that probably their authorities could tell them more if they liked. Of course, we were told what would happen to England when the submarine campaign began. The Unteroffizier in charge of the parcel room informed us with great glee that the English would be unable to receive any more parcels. Although pooh-poohing his suggestions, many prisoners had secret fears on the subject. There was great excitement in Boche circles when the first batch of parcels bearing postmarks of a later date to that of the first day of the unlimited submarine campaign arrived in the camp. This did not look at all like a complete blockade of England. After careful thought, a satisfactory explanation was forthcoming from the under-officer. Of course, the English postal authorities must have faked the postmarks in order to cause these very misgivings to arise in the minds of true Germans. Again, he and his satellites were able to look on the bright side of things. But not for long did their joy last. The steady stream of incoming parcels continued, and joy gave way to sulkiness and then disillusionment in the minds of those Germans who saw with their own eyes. Depend upon it, these men told others what they had seen, and so it spread. All the same, they still imagined, in May 1917, that we had far less food in England than was really the case. Talking about food reminds me of the behavior of the Krefeld children when we prisoners went out for walks on parole. Although undoubtedly brought up upon ideas of hate against England, and presumably thoroughly informed of the odious natures of all Englishmen, these children very soon forgot their lessons and rapidly became great friends with the prisoners, English, Russians, French, Belgians, and Arabs alike. Of course, to a certain extent, their behavior was due to their hopes of getting odd bits of chocolate or a biscuit or two from their enemy friends. It was not unusual to see the walk, generally consisting of about 40 prisoners, returning with a crowd of kids of all kinds and description hanging on to its edges. Their usual practice was to get hold of a prisoner's hand and trot beside him, asking sometimes for chocolate and occasionally for old tennis balls. These children's disregard of the attitude, which the warlord has decided must be displayed against the English, was not allowed to continue unchecked. I expect the children were the subject of a special army order, as they suddenly ceased to join us in our walks, and the usual crowd of urchins who stood for hours in the road outside the barracks in the hopes of having something thrown out to them, were chased from their points of vantage, and silence once more reigned in the one-time noisy road. On special occasions, the schools were given holidays by orders from headquarters. A victory or the occupation of a town was always commemorated in this way. On these occasions, the headmaster or mistress would march the school past our prison and order the kids to sing patriotic songs. We always laughed at them, and the girls would sometimes forget to sing and would wave their handkerchiefs to us instead, causing their bear leaders to get wild with rage. Eventually, when the Germans got tired of victories and wanted food instead, their holidays ceased, and we no longer had to listen to shrill voices shrieking Die Wacht am Rhein or Deutschland über alles, time after time ad nauseum. It was extraordinary how the feelings of the German people changed towards us while at Krefeld. At first, nothing was too bad to say or do to the captives of the Kultur nation, but it is marvelous what a good bloodletting and perpetual food shortage has done for them. So tame did they get that our windows, at first only open at the very top and all covered with white paint, were eventually made so that one could sit and look out quite easily. No fist shaking or gestures of hate were made by the time the windows were allowed open, so prisoners and Boche civilians simply stared at each other quite peaceably. There was one thing that specially worried us in the camp. By some means or other, all attempts to escape by digging tunnels were discovered. Although the foundations of the prison buildings were literally honeycombed with tunnels, and attempts were made without number, never once did one succeed. Most ingenious efforts were made, but despite the most rigid secrecy and the utmost caution, sooner or later in would come a search party and go straight to the scene of the excavation, and often catch the diggers red-handed. It was believed that there were spies among the prisoners. At any rate, everything that went on was known in the commandant's office sooner or later. The members of one party, on being caught, were actually complimented on their fine work by the Boers, who were full of joy naturally at having found the tunnel. For many months before we left Krefeld, the Germans used to search the ground floor rooms and cellars daily. Not infrequently, they would pay 2 or 3 visits to the cellars in one night. Their searching included tapping the walls, ceilings, and floors for hollow places. Periodically, a search for the earth excavated from these holes and hidden away would lead to the Boers discovering many hundredweights of sand and rubble stowed away safely. Searches were sometimes made in our rooms for articles of contraband. Civilian clothes and maps, compasses, and various tools were the chief objects of interest to them. These searches on some occasions were extended to the persons of the prisoners, especially after an order forbidding the possession of real German money had been issued. Of course, none of us liked being searched, and we showed our searchers pretty clearly what we thought of the whole affair. I must say that the commandant did not order many searches, and probably those that did occur were due to the orders of a superior. These searches were usually carried out by the under-officers and men of a different unit from that which guarded the camp, in order to prevent those who were quite friendly to us among the prison guards letting us off too lightly. During 1915, we were all inoculated and vaccinated against a number of diseases. In all, we were each punctured 7 times. Many prisoners objected to these measures and did their utmost to avoid being done. The German authorities caught the majority and treated them to these unpleasant attentions, however. The inoculation was a comic sight. One after the other, the prisoners filed past the doctors, who worked automatically at their pricking job. It often was a case of almost leather punching when the tough skins of some of the rougher types of prisoners had to be pierced. The needles were far from sharp, and I believe had to be constantly changed. Small parties of prisoners were constantly leaving and arriving at the camp. This was done, so it was generally thought, to let the people see prisoners being taken about and make them imagine that the German armies were always taking new batches. New arrivals from the front were sometimes brought in, and we would generally worry the lives out of them for their first few days, asking for news of all kinds. Hardly ever were they able to tell us anything we did not know from the newspapers, but it often happened that all sorts of wild rumors arose from the remarks of fellows who were simply badgered into saying things they did not really mean or had not thought over thoroughly. Early in the spring of 1917, the Germans brought 100-odd mercantile marine officers and men from Karlsruhe to our camp at Krefeld, with what object nobody rightly knew. These men had been through a very bad time and were very pleased to get to a camp where there were English army officers. The majority of them had been captured by the Muva, and some of them had been in her for weeks while she cruised about sinking other ships. They had been half-starved and had very little clothing with them. In several cases, the Germans had sunk their ships so quickly that the wretched crews had had no time to put on any of their clothing and had had to take to the boats in whatever garments they were wearing at the moment. When they arrived at Krefeld, they were received by the military officers and had a breakfast given them at once. They were extraordinarily pleased to get some decent food, and we so arranged it that they never lacked English food with which to augment their camp rations while at Krefeld. In connection with this, the Germans were very amusing. They expressed their astonishment that officers of our army should take so much interest in British mercantile marine common seamen as to provide them with food and actually wait on them at the first decent meal they had seen for months. A collection of clothes of all descriptions was made, and most extraordinary sights were to be seen as the result of this. Stokers promenading in the uniforms of guards officers and ship's boys in huge British warms. I think the Germans had hoped to annoy us army officers by this introduction of merchant seamen. If this was so, they failed utterly to achieve their object. The greatest good feeling existed between the two lots in the camp, and after 3 or 4 weeks, the merchant sailors were removed to another camp where I am afraid they were less comfortable. The Germans were not the only surprised people over this affair. The French, although liberty, equality, and fraternity is their national motto, were very astonished at the way in which good fellowship and camaraderie was fostered between army officers and merchant seamen. When the Russian Revolution broke out, we all wondered how the Russians in the prison camp would take it. The majority of them seemed to have very little decided opinion on the subject, but were generally inclined to think it a good thing for their country. It was then that we were told that the Russians were all to be sent to another camp, which made the whole camp think furiously as to the reason for this move of the German authorities. Was it peace in sight, and the prisoners were to be concentrated in camps by nationalities near the frontiers of neutrals bordering their own countries, preparatory to the general exodus at the end of the war? Did it mean a separate peace with Russia? These and other theories were discussed backwards and forwards. Eventually, the Russians went, and many of us were very sorry to lose them, as it meant a loss of all means of continuing to learn the language from their Russian friends. 200 English arrived from Gütersloh in their place, and then the departure of the French began. The leave-taking between the French and English was very cordial and annoyed the Germans very much, as while the former went from us, we all sang the Marseillaise. The English continued to sing it until the French were out of sight along the road to the station. Then we became an all-English prison camp. There seemed to be no room to move, as everyone was out of doors, and a great percentage of the Russians and many of the French had kept to their rooms a great deal. We were only about 6 weeks in this state, As in May once again, the Germans turned the camp upside down, this time ordering its complete evacuation by all the English.
This concludes today's reading of 13 Days, The Chronicle of an Escape from a German Prison, by John Caunter. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.